Hello and namaste. My name is Samir Kalra, Managing Director for Policy and Programs with the Hindu American Foundation. Welcome to our fireside chat conversation with a very special guest, Terry Milewski. Terry is an award-winning journalist and author of Blood for Blood, 50 Years of the Global Khalistan Project. Milewski was a senior correspondent for the Canadian Broadcasting Company, reporting in over 30 countries during a 30-plus year career with the CBC. In 1986, he set up the Nationals Bureau in Jerusalem, becoming its first Middle East correspondent. He later spent 8 years in the CBC's Washington Bureau, covering the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, then moved to Vancouver in 1995. He continued to travel widely, with frequent returns to the Middle East, the US, and India. He won a Gemini Award for his coverage of the 1997 APEC Summit, a Webster for his coverage of the Air India bombing, and a Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Ray of Light, a documentary shot in India. Please join me in welcoming Terry to the program today. Very pleased to have you for a conversation on Khalistan and attacks on the Western soil. Welcome, Terry.
Oh, namaste. Thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
Great, Terry. So, today we want to start by just having a discussion about exactly what is Khalistan. A lot of people don't necessarily know about the idea or the movement, how it started, and the level of violence that it led to, both in India as well as globally, and particularly in a number of Western countries. So if we can just start there and talk about what is Khalistan at a conceptual level.
I guess we should begin at the beginning and do a sort of quick potted history. The Khalistan movement is what you might call a zombie music movement, in as much as it seems to be surviving and even thriving long after its reported demise. It was supposed to have been wiped out in the early 90s, but it's still with us and alive and kicking. The concept, of course, is to break away a chunk of northwestern India on the border with Pakistan, and particularly the province, the state, I should say, of Punjab, to form an independent state for the Sikhs, who form the majority of, not an overwhelming majority, but most of the population of Punjab is about 58%. And Punjab, of course, is also the homeland for 90% or more of the world's Sikhs. There's a couple of million scattered around the rest of the world and around India, where they form only about 2% of the vast population of India. And they're also, by the way, about 2% of the population of Canada and the United States, where thriving diaspora populations, in the Indian diaspora generally, and the Sikh diaspora in particular, have done very well as traveling overseas, and they've prospered, as they have in India, quite remarkably in the professions, in business, you name it. So much so, in fact, that the Sikhs in particular occupy if you divide the wealth of India, the growing wealth of India, into 5 bands, about 60% of Sikhs fall in the top band. No other religious grouping, not the Hindus, not the Muslims, come anywhere close. They're more about 20% of them are in that top quintile, I guess you would call it. So the concept is to form an independent state on the grounds, broadly stated, that partition failed to give the Sikhs a country the way it gave the Hindus a country in India and the Muslims a country in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And it's been propelled to a significant degree, the movement, I mean, by the support, the enduring support of Pakistan, not necessarily because Pakistan yearns for the Sikhs to breathe free and to free themselves from the Indian yoke. If you look at how Pakistanis treat their own religious minorities, including Sikhs, that idea would pretty soon be in the trash. Rather, Pakistan has always supported the Khalistan movement for its own strategic purposes. It likes the idea of a strategic buffer between Pakistan and India that happens to cut off India's land access to Kashmir, another strategic priority for Pakistan. So it's always been convenient for Pakistan to exact revenge upon India for the war in 1971, which tore off a chunk of Pakistan, East Pakistan, and turned it into Bangladesh. They never got over that. They want their revenge. They want to bleed India. Khalistan gives them a mechanism for doing that. And without Pakistan, the Khalistan movement probably would never have been able to mount what was a extremely violent insurgency, armed insurgency, throughout the 1980s and the early 90s, ending with its being crushed, really, by very heavy-handed and violent police action led by legendary KPS Gill, who became known as India's super cop as a result of winning that battle and supposedly wiping out the Khalistan insurgency. Well, they didn't wipe out the Khalistan movement. So the movement began with this kind of nostalgia for a imaginary pre-partition age. Partition, of course, is to blame for everything that goes wrong in India, as you probably know. In 1947, at least 1 million people died. The figures are still in dispute. And there was a certain amount of nostalgia among Sikhs for the old Sikh empire. 200 years ago, Maharaja Ranjit Singh established in all of historical, and that includes Indian Punjab today and Pakistani Punjab today. That whole area, or at least a good chunk of it, was under the thumb of the great Maharaja Ranjit Singh. 200 years ago, it wasn't much of an empire in terms of longevity. It lasted about 40 years. As long as Ranjit Singh himself was on the throne, it lasted. He was a wily, one-eyed alcoholic, a very interesting historical figure. Seized the Kohinoor diamond from the Afghan Shah, who was on the run from Kabul. Many wonderful stories of that time, and Sikhs did have and still do have a certain nostalgia for the very idea of a Sikh empire. Why can't we have one too, as Ranjit Singh did? So that's if you will, the ancient history. And coming up to the present day, the reason it seems to survive, this movement, is that there is a small minority within the Sikhs, a small minority group driven by a nostalgia, by religious fervor, and by a whole host of other motivations to maintain this movement, in particular to register a sort of geostrategic revenge against the Hindu-dominated state of India for the massacres that occurred back in 1984. Don't get me started on 1984. We'll be here all day. But simply stated, in the wake of the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, as she then was at the end of October of 1984, there were some horrendous pogroms, massacres of thousands of Sikhs in retaliation because she was murdered by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards. This arose out of the small war that erupted at the Golden Temple in the Sikh holy city of Amritsar. To this day, nobody's over it, really. There are still people, members of the Congress Party, who were blamed, and quite rightly, for their complicity and their cooperation and the cover-up of the massacres of 1984, who are still in jail. Sergeant Kumar is still in jail after decades of cover-ups and sliding away from justice. Finally, the Indian state did have to put some people in jail for that, but that certainly hasn't mollified the militant Khalistanis. The most famous modern achievement of the Khalistanis, if you can call it an achievement, was what was until 9/11, just past the deadliest terrorist attack anywhere ever, namely what Indians call the Kanishka bombing, Kanishka being the name of the plane, an ancient emperor, And that was the destruction of Air India's Flight 182 on its flight from Montreal to London Heathrow. It exploded over the ocean, over the Atlantic off the Irish coast, and killed 329 people. And also, there was a second bomb meant to explode simultaneously on the other side of the world in a kind of terrorist spectacular. There was a second bomb which exploded prematurely on the ground. It must have been jostled, perhaps, and killed 2 baggage handlers at Narita Airport in Tokyo. So there is this complex stew of memories: the Sikh Empire, the attack on the Golden Temple, the killing of the fundamentalist preacher Bhindranwale, who's called a saint today by Khalistanis, at the Golden Temple, attacked by the Indian Army to roust them out, the massacres of 1984. And this bubbles up today, this stew, in the most virulent form currently, which is reminiscent in some ways of the 1980s, being the referendum movement, which poses as, hey, it's democratic. You can't complain about this. We're having a vote among Sikhs in the diaspora around the world, in Australia, in Germany, in Italy, in Canada, in the UK, and in the US. We're having a vote among the diaspora, among all Sikhs over the age of 18, should Punjab be freed of Indian occupation? Should it be an independent country? And what's virulent about that? Why do I use that word? Well, the answer is that their motto, if you ask them, is ballots, not bullets. We're different now. We're not fighting an armed insurgency. We're Democrats. Oh, there's a problem, because the campaign in Canada, for example, is named for its poster boy, who is the mastermind of the Air India bombing, Talvinder Singh Parmar, leader of the Baba Khalsa terrorist group. This was a bloodthirsty terrorist atrocity. They didn't even care that there were 33 Sikhs on that plane. They didn't care who they blew up. The people on the plane had absolutely nothing to do with their war of independence, if you will. And so the idea that it's a democratic movement is rather contradicted, isn't it, by the choice. And when I say poster boy, I'm not talking metaphorically. I mean, on its posters, there are life-size glamour shots of gun-toting, sword-toting, in a very ornate medieval turban of Talvinder Parmar, holding him up as a martyr, a shaheed, a great leader, Jatidar, Bhai, brother. All of these titles are loaded on top of him as a model for Sikh youth of today. And the voting center in Toronto is named for the assassins of Indira Gandhi, as are the voting centers in Australia, and so on, and so on, and so on. So they hold these martyrs up as their models and their poster boys, while at the same time telling us they're all about democracy. So you could be forgiven for having your doubts about that. That's a very rapid, potted history, and I'm sure 100 questions arise from it.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. That was very comprehensive. You know, one thing I think that's very notable about the movement, both during the 80s and 90s at the height of the militancy and terrorism in Indian Punjab, as well as today, of course, during that time period, we saw, I think, between 30,000 and 40,000 people that died, all innocent civilians, terrorists, as well as military or police personnel, during the height of the militant period. But it was always accompanied by a lot of hate propaganda, especially towards non-Sikhs or Sikhs that were considered to be collaborating, if you will, with the Indian government. And we see a lot of that today as well, whether it's in Canada or in other Western nations where there's a demonization, not just of India or the Indian state, but of Hindus, of any Sikhs that are viewed to be going against the movement. Can you talk a little bit about how this propaganda has helped to kind of feed the movement today, and how it's accompanying, whether it's the referendums that are happening in Canada or it's in the UK or the US or in other Western countries?
Well, to a large degree, you're right to raise that because it is, in many respects, a motivating force. It's not just a sort of amorphous feeling that we'd like to be independent. It's you have to be something to be independent. You need something to be independent from, and the Hindus seems to be to fit that bill. There is a very famous, for example, a speech made at the founding convention in Madison Square Garden, actually, in New York, uh, by the number two in the Baba Khalsa terrorist group in Canada, a gentleman named Arjab Singh Bagri, one of the Air India suspects, who was acquitted at the trial in Vancouver. And he made a famous speech at the founding convention of the WSO, the World Sikh Organization, in which he said, many have said that Hindus are our brothers, but I say to you, I give you my assurance that until we kill 50,000 Hindus, we will not rest, unquote. So there's a nice democratic line for you. And then, of course, in the wake of that, that was back in July of 1984. So not long before, they put their that cry into action with the assassination of Indira Gandhi. But in the wake of that, we had the reign, if I can put it that way, the brief reign of Bhindranwale, the patron saint, if you will, of the Khalistanis, at the Golden Temple, where he basically turned it into an armed camp. And what was he armed against? And the answer again seems to have been Hindus, because he animated a killing spree, which took many Hindu lives, not just Hindus, by the way, because when it morphed into a more generalized armed insurgency, the Khalistani fighters did not hesitate to wipe out Sikhs as well if they stood in their way. For example, 1,400 Sikh policemen were killed in the 80s and early 90s, along with many of their family members, to punish these Sikhs for being bad Sikhs, because the only good Sikh is one that believes with us that we should drive the Hindus out of Punjab. And many of the massacres of the period that were carried out by Sikh militants were aimed at forcing out the Hindus from Punjab, ethnic cleansing on a grand scale to drive millions of Hindus out of Punjab, to cleanse Punjab so that it could be a Sikh majority state. And when I say massacres, I mean car pulls up on a country road, armed men get out, they hijack a bus that's rolling down into the town, they call out all the Hindus, line them up in the ditch, and gun them all down. Exactly what happened in the village of Lalru, 1986, for example. And the same gang of goons then went off and did it again to another bus in the neighboring state of Haryana. Death toll 70 in one weekend's work. And 2 or 3 of those killers, by the way, were Canadians, nice Canadian boys from Toronto. So the drive to get rid of Hindus was extremely strong then, and it still seems to animate many of the Khalistanis today. And to some degree, but not exclusively, it's a religious war, yes.
And I think one symbol of that is that wherever we see these referendums taking place, mainly by this group Sikhs for Justice, we've seen a series of vandalisms and defacements of Hindu temples that are happening around the same time. I think this past weekend is a perfect example that there was a referendum in Surrey in Canada. And at the same time, that same weekend, there was an attack on a Hindu temple in Surrey as well, a defacement of the temple wall. And we've seen that pattern happening in the UK, in Australia, in the US, to a lesser extent in the US, but it's happening here as well. Why do you think they're targeting, Hindu temples at the same time that these referendums are taking place? Are they trying to provoke a reaction, or is it just a manifestation again of that hate and that we are trying to express our freedom from the Hindu population or the Hindu majority?
It's a visible demonstration that our rhetoric is working. It's a visible demonstration that you see, we can sneak out at night and paint Hindustan Murabad, death to Hindustan, and Khalistan Zindabad. Long live Khalistan. We can do this with impunity. We can mess up your temple with impunity. It's a show of strength. And by the way, many such incidents have been happening over the last few months in Toronto as well, and nobody's been caught. So they're right; they are getting away with it, and they're getting away with that, and with this absurd pretense that they're all about democracy, while their poster boys are basically terrorists. And it seems to help group cohesion. It helps to establish you within the gang. There's a sort of a gang culture going on, and you gain street cred, to use the modern vernacular, by going out with a can of paint and spray painting the Hindu temple down the street with graffiti. You're expressing your anger towards the Hindus for being the dominant power in India, and for resisting our right to have an independent state. That's the way they feel about it.
Sure. And I think we've also seen Indian consulates being targets of arson attempts right here in San Francisco, where I'm based. A couple of those incidents happening recently as well. And the one group that seems to be behind a lot of this violence and activism and extremism is a group called Sikhs for Justice. And you referenced the leader, Mr. Bannu, recently. I'm sorry, a few minutes ago. Can you talk a little bit about this group, how they've kind of come to power, where they're getting their funding from, and how they've kind of taken the mantle up of the Khalistan movement?
Well, it's they have managed to seize the leadership, and by they I mean principally Mr. Panun. Gopal Singh Panun is actually an American export. Thanks a lot. He's a lawyer from New York, who is banned as a terrorist, considered officially a terrorist in India, which has seized his properties. Although there's no evidence that I'm aware of that he is personally engaged in terrorist actions, the designation of him as a terrorist by the state of India has been validated by the Delhi High Court, and under Indian law, I guess that's enough. His takeover of the Khalistan movement reflects the energy and the enterprise with which he has come up with an animating idea, something to keep everyone busy, namely the referendum, and to show progress. Because every time he runs a vote in a new city, whether it's Melbourne in Australia or Brampton in Ontario, or yesterday and the day before in Surrey, British Columbia, he can show that things are happening. He's making things happen. And he can show that there are lineups down the street, because they conduct the vote very slowly, apparently. They have lineups down the street and around the corner, and then of people lining up to vote. And if you ask about the integrity of the vote, what could possibly be wrong with that? We have an independent commission that's going to validate these votes. Strangely enough, we never hear very much from this independent commission. They say, yeah, it's a fair vote, but they never give us how many voted. They never tell us, for example, how many times did each person vote? And I raised that question, by the way, because I have a Sikh friend in London who recounted how he registered to vote in one of these referendum votes, and he entered. It said name, and he entered his name, Angelina Jolie, and the computer came back with "Bing! Congratulations, you're registered. Have a nice day." So there is room for doubt. Let's put it politely about the integrity of the vote, but to his credit, Mr. Panun he's fired up the troops, and he's given them something to show the world that Sikhs want an independent state. Well, the problem, of course, is that they're driving straight into a brick wall, and that brick wall is called the government of India. Because if they have a vote, no matter how successful it is, no matter how many hundreds of thousands of Sikhs turn out to vote in this referendum, it don't mean a damn thing because they represent a tiny minority of the world's Sikh population, most of which still lives in Punjab, and most of which has no interest in this at all. They remember the 1980s. They remember the deaths, the killings of Sikhs and Hindus alike. They remember how much blood flowed. You used the figure of 30,000. I won't argue with you. It may be between 20 and 30,000, depends on who you're listening to. But let me just insert, not to be too boring about it, a couple of numbers. There is, you are allowed to run in Punjab elections as a separatist. As long, you can't advocate armed struggle by any means, absolutely not. This is the soft option is that by political struggle alone, you wish to have as part of your platform an independent state. And in the last election, in a Sikh majority state, they got 2.5% of the vote and no seats. Not an aberration. In fact, that was a pretty good year for them. In the election before that, in 2017, they got 0.3% of the vote. A pitiful, a microscopic showing by Sikh separatists in the state where most of the world's Sikhs lives. So I'm sorry that takes us a little bit off your track of your question, but it's relevant to the referendum. And that's what's happening today. That's how Qanun, which is about your question, that's how he is animating the movement, is to bring them out for this referendum, which is going to run them into this brick wall, because when they go to the UN, this is the theory, that they will show great enthusiasm, they'll have a huge turnout voting, yes, let's have an independent state, and then they'll be able to go with the wind in their sails to the United Nations to validate and to sponsor a referendum within India. Then then they encounter the brick wall that I described, because the Indian government isn't going to countenance that. It's not even legal under the Indian constitution to tinker with India's sacred borders and its territorial integrity. So there's no way that the Indian government is going to counter a secessionist movement in Punjab or anywhere else in India. So I don't know how you make them. I don't think you can. So what is this all about? What is it for? And it's very hard to answer that question.
Is there any indication of where the funding comes from for somebody like Banu and Sikhs for Justice more broadly? Because they're obviously, have, it seems like, an unlimited amount of money to keep holding these referendums, keep putting out this online propaganda. Is there any sense of where they're getting funded from?
Well, you're expecting me to say Pakistan, but I'm not going to say that. And the reason for that is because, number one, Pakistan doesn't have any money. Number two, they don't need Pakistan's money. What they need, and have always needed, is a place to run to, a safe haven, a refuge. That's Pakistan's role. That and a supply of weapons back in the day during the insurgency, and medical care, training on those weapons, diplomatic support and cover. There has to be somewhere. I mean, you can't have a small band of insurrectionists dash across the border to carry out terrorist attacks as they did for about 12 or 13 years during the insurgency, if they have nowhere to run to. Where are they going to go when they run out of ammo? When they've exploded their bombs in the marketplace or the theater, which is what they did. You need somewhere to run to, and Pakistan is the only place available. So they tend to go along with Pakistan, even though I don't believe that Pakistan funds the movement, as I've already said, because they don't have a lot of money in Pakistan. But also the Sikh diaspora worldwide has, as I said earlier, done very well. They've made themselves quite prosperous by their own industry, and they've supported Sikhs for justice quite generously. And so they're supporting themselves financially, well, they could use a few friends diplomatically. That's what they lack.
And so, one of the things that we've seen is that a lot of the Sikhs for Justice activities or activists or extremists also have had some sort of criminal records in India or have been tied up with other, as you mentioned, I think earlier, gang violence here in the US, in Canada. I think earlier this year in the US, there was a huge US government raid. And in that, a number of activists were arrested, and a lot of them had prior records in India for committing violence, and a lot of them were tied to the consulate attack in San Francisco as well.
Yes.
Can you talk about this confluence of violent gang activity as well as this activism or extremism within the Khalistan movement that's happening maybe in Canada and the US and other parts of the West?
I think it's not very mysterious when you consider the mentality. The mentality of the separatists is we're against the system. We're enemies of the system. We're against the man. In this case, the man is the iniquitous, fascist, genocidal Hindu government in New Delhi. But it translates very easily to the man who is allied with that evil government here in the United States or Canada or Australia or wherever. And it does seem to be more than a coincidence, and it's certainly more than occasional, that we find that if you draw a Venn diagram, for example, of criminals, organized crime in, say, the lower mainland of Canada's British Columbia, and the Sikhs for Justice and the Khalistan movement, you might have a hard time finding where those diagrams do not overlap, because they overlap splendidly. I'll tell you one tiny anecdote. At the Air India bombing trial, where he was acquitted, a wealthy businessman who financed the Baba Khalsa terrorist group named Referendums Malik, who was murdered in a gangland hit just over a year ago in Surrey, British Columbia. He was on trial and he needed an alibi. I'll spare you the details. And so they brought in to testify for his defense a young gangster named Mindy Banda, who said that, he told the court under oath, I made a very good living in credit card fraud and drug smuggling, carrying bales of marijuana across the border into the United States, coming back with cocaine. And yeah, I did very well about it. And I had a squabble with my dad. I mean, I didn't wear a beard and a turban, and he was kind of orthodox. And I argued with my dad, and guess who took me in? The kind Mr. Malik, the prisoner in the dock. He was like a father figure to me, said this young gangster. And that little anecdote tells you something. This father figure he thought nothing of taking in a criminal as it were, like another son. I think he had 4 of his own already. And it was completely normal in his milieu, in the circles in which he moved, to not just be a criminal, but to hang out with criminals day and night. So he was involved in welfare fraud. He was involved in immigration fraud. You name it. It seems to be a criminal underworld. And it seems that he, as in many other mafia against mafia conflicts that we've seen everywhere in the world, he fell afoul of it when he was gunned down at the wheel of his car in July of last year. And what happened a year later, more recently in June of this year, to Bhai Jathedar Shahid Hardeep Nijjar, the important Khalistani leader, number 2 in Sikhs for Justice, and number 1 at the Gurdwara, the Guru Nanak Temple in Surrey. He was gunned down in a very similar gangland hit. 2 guys, masks, gun you down when you drive up in your car. They run, they hop in the getaway car and then they burn the getaway car. There's a system. There's a routine, and followed the same routine. So yes, I would say that the case of Malik, the evidence that we heard at trial, and the evidence of these killings, notwithstanding that Sikhs for Justice and the Khalistanis more generally blame India for supposedly sending out 007 hit squads of deadly diplomats who are going to gun down Khalistani figures around the world. No evidence for that whatsoever, although that is definitely what they are telling us. They believe that India is to blame for this squalid little gangland vendetta in a corner of British Columbia. I think we can conclude from this that Khalistani militancy and criminality may be two sides of the very same coin.
You know, given that, why have we not seen a more robust, I guess, reaction or response from Canadian authorities? And, you know, this is beyond the complaint from the Indian government about the freedom of speech issues or the activism that these, these groups are involved in terms of advocating for a Khalistan state. When we actually see criminal connections, we see violence, we see incidents of vandalisms at temples, we see attacks on consulates or threats to diplomats. At least in those instances, why don't we see a robust response from the Canadian authorities?
Well, that's a very embarrassing question for me as a Canadian, because if I answer you truthfully, it's not going to look good for us. But you ask, I'm going to tell you. The minority government of Justin Trudeau is sustained, as you may know, by the votes of a left-wing minority party, the New Democratic Party, which is led by Jagmeet Singh, a lifelong Khalistani sympathizer. And if you glance at the polls in Canada, you will notice that probably Mr. Trudeau does not want to precipitate an early election by antagonizing his partners in the New Democratic Party, by driving them out of their agreement to hold up the Trudeau government, during good behavior, as long as the Trudeau government doesn't take any action against them. So that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story, because even before Jagmeet Singh took over that party and formed an alliance, as temporary as it may be, at least for the life of this parliament, which ends, I guess, in 2025, with the Liberals. Even before that, all parties in Canada, I'm including the Conservatives, I'm sad to say, because they look like, if the polls are correct, that they would form the next government under Pierre Poilievre. They have not acquitted themselves with great distinction on this file either, because all parties in Canadian politics have been playing the same game. That is, go to the Vaisakhi parades in your district, smile and wave as the parade floats go by with colorful posters garlanded with gold tinsel, showing the faces of gun-toting assassins and martyrs and mass murderers from the heyday of the Sikh insurgency in Punjab. And you smile and you wave and you hustle for votes, and you don't say a word about the martyr posters. You don't say that this is disgusting. You don't say that this is misleading our children to think that these people are heroes. This man here blew 329 completely innocent civilians out of the blue sky in 1985, and you're holding him up as a hero? Well, that is what is happening. And all the parties have had this craven reluctance to tell it like it is. It's been normalized in Canada. Not just in Canada. I mean, some of this has happened to a frightening degree in the UK as well. But what I know best is Canada. I'll stick to that. And they have been all playing the same dirty game of pandering to the Khalistanis, and I'm including the Conservatives. I mean, the last time that, as you know, Trudeau's got in a spot of bother in his latest trip to the G20 New Delhi in recent days. But his first trip to India in 2018 ended in an absolute fiasco, with the realization that by the CBC, I reported this story, um, that a convicted Khalistani terrorist who actually attempted to murder by shooting a visiting Indian cabinet minister on Vancouver Island in 1986 and was convicted, he got an invitation somehow to Trudeau's inner circle. He was invited to not one but two elegant diplomatic receptions in New Delhi during Trudeau's visit in 2018 to dine with the Prime Minister and to pose for selfies with the Prime Minister's wife. And nobody in Trudeau's entourage thought that it might be a problem, that this might not look very good to the Indian government when they found out about it. Of course, it hit the fan when this was discovered. The Prime Minister's entourage was forced to scramble and to disinvite this individual. His name was Jasper Atwal, from the reception at the High Commissioner's residence. And it was embarrassment all round. And Trudeau came home with his tail between his legs, because this was a rare eruption where the cozy little deals behind the scenes emerged into the open. That has not gone away. You'd think they would have learned the lesson, but apparently not, because this G20, in both cases of the UK and Canada, where it was raised by the Indian side, there was a response from the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak, for the British, said, we are not going to allow any space for Khalistani extremism in the UK. And Indians loved it. Rishi Sunak is a hero in New Delhi today. And by the way, the British passed legislation 17 years ago in 2006, making the glorification of terrorism a criminal offense. So they put a ring around, okay, here's freedom of speech. That much freedom of speech is fine. That's all kosher. But across that line, where you are inciting violence, where you are, for example, as the posters are doing now, drawing targets on the backs of Indian diplomats by accusing them, with no evidence whatsoever, of being the killers of Mr. Najjar in Surrey. When you do that, that's beyond the pale. That's against the law. They've changed their law to make that clear. Canada has not, and there's no sign that it will, because when the time came for Mr. Trudeau to answer the question in New Delhi, he muffed it. I'll spare you the details, but he just waffled. There's no sign that Canada's going to do anything about it.
Given the learned lessons that you have from the Canadian experience, as we wrap up our conversation today, what advice would you give to American policymakers and federal authorities and local authorities in dealing with the issue here, where we're not quite at the level that Canada has been? We haven't seen the level of violence, of course, and the horrific tragedy that Canada has, but we have seen extremism on our own soil here in the US as well. And we see increasing activism and extremism by groups like Sikhs for Justice across the country. What would be your advice to American policymakers and how to address this before it reaches the level of Canada or worse?
Well, there used to be a popular phrase in the United States, in US politics, isn't there? Moral clarity. Above all, this is what, think about what we've just been discussing. It's been a lack of moral clarity. And if there was one, it's not for me to advise anyone in the US, but I would say this: it's extremely important to call them out the very first time it happens. When somebody comes to you and says, we don't want you to be, let us do our thing in the Khalistan movement in San Francisco or Boston or wherever it is. You just let us do our thing. We're not asking you to, make speeches in support of an independent state. We don't expect that, but we just want you to be quiet and let us do our thing and, be seen with us. And when we have our Vaisakhi Day, come to our parade and smile and wave. We don't ask you to make speeches. You don't have to commit yourself publicly to anything. Just don't get in our way. That's when you say, the very first approach, that's when you say, stop. I'm not going to sit still for that. I'm not going to make any deals. And the reason I suggest that, although it sounds that I'm expecting politicians to be full of courage, I'm not really, because it turns out on close inspection to be a bit of an illusion that you need to pander to these people to get them to mass together and vote for you. Because what about the rest of the Indian diaspora, Sikh and non-Sikh alike? Because they may be quiet, but I think that you will find that they vote just as eagerly and in just the same numbers as the Khalistanis do. Khalistanis may be more organized. They may show up in a block of 10,000 votes. But I think that what American politicians need to appreciate is that the time will come, if they have a significant Indian population in their district, when what is in fact a small minority will come to you pretending to represent the majority, pretending that we have the key that will get you elected if you sing our song, and at least if you don't condemn us and don't get it in our way. Don't listen to that, because that way is a slippery slope, and you'll end up in a very bad place indeed.
Well, with that, Terry, I think we're coming to the end of our time today. But as usual, it's always an honor and a privilege to talk to you. You're a wealth of knowledge on this subject. Unfortunately, I'm sure it's not the subject that you wanted to be an expert on, but nonetheless,
it happened to me.
It happened to you, exactly. But we really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for sharing your insight on this very complex yet growing and dangerous issue within the Western world. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it. Thank you.